Welcome, everybody. This is High Side, Low Side, Season 8, Episode 7. My name is Zach. I'm here with my friend Spurgeon. Today's topic is displacement creep. How much horsepower is too much horsepower? Also on the docket, babies on bikes and how riding changes as you get older. But first, a quick word from our sponsor, Motul.
So Motul doesn't just sponsor the High Side, Low Side podcast. They sponsor all different types of athletes out there competing at the highest levels of competition, including the Vance and Hines Moto America race team, because they want to make sure that their oil is competitive at the highest level necessary to make sure that when you're using it in your motorcycle, it's going to hold true for you as well. So to learn about all of the Motul products out there, head over to Revzilla.com/Motul. That's Revzilla.com/MOTUL. And thanks again to Motul for sponsoring just Zach and myself, in addition to all of those great athletes out there. While you're over on Revzilla.com, make sure you check out the RPM program. That's the Riders Preferred Membership Program, to learn about all the benefits that the RPM program can provide for you, the motorcyclist amongst us. You can head over to Revzilla.com/RPM. That's Revzilla.com/RPM. Now, on with the show. All right, so jumping right into Not the News, we have a very special little treat for you today, because a week ago, we had the newest CTXP episode release, Babies on Motorcycles. Now, if you've not seen it, you have no idea what we're talking about, but that's why we have Zach Quartz here. Well, we have Zach Quartz here because I'm stuck with him for this podcast, and I can't get away from him if I tried. I love him too darn much. But Zach was one of the co-hosts in the podcast, or in the CTXP episode. So I don't want to give any setup. I think we're going to take 3 minutes, and really what I'd like for you, Zach, is what were you thinking? What did you learn? And should you strap a baby to the back, or in some cases, apparently the front of a motorcycle? Well, start the timer, Chase. Start the timer. Zach, you may go.
What were you thinking? Was an alternate title for this CTXP episode, actually.
That your wives came up with?
Exactly. Ari and I, our wives were surprisingly supportive of the whole thing, I think. I cannot say, as of the recording of this episode, whether or not the episode of CTXP has garnered rave reviews or if people were completely disgusted. I'll have to let you decide for yourself. But yeah, basically the outline is Ari and I recently became fathers. Ari last summer and myself the previous fall. So we have approximately a 9-month-old and an 18-month-old around our respective houses. And, basically, like, you can wait until your kid is old enough to walk and talk and make their own decisions and decide whether they want to be on a little dirt bike or whatever. But that seemed kind of boring. And we thought, they put babies on bicycles, right? There's little bicycle seats, and then you put babies in cars. Cars are plenty dangerous. And then, if you go to Thailand or, Southeast Asia or Central America, you often see a whole family on a scooter.
When we were there last year.
India, sure, yeah. So, why not bring babies to bikes and really expand what's possible from a family standpoint with motorcycles and from a bonding standpoint, and obviously makes their neck stronger potentially.
Well, for those of you that didn't see the episode yet, you didn't take a normal approach of maybe like a sidecar or a three-wheeler.
Right.
You went a bit extreme.
Wheels. Right.
And I thought the most interesting part, and maybe certain people didn't get this. So our longtime producer of CTXP is one Spencer Robert.
Sure.
And in the final test to see if this was a good idea or not, it was actually Spencer's brother, Taylor, who was the world-renowned dirt bike racer that you employed to help test this. Is that not correct?
Yes, a cameo from Taylor Robert, winner of the International 6 Days Enduro. I think that's what ISDE stands for. And X Games gold medalist. And fun fact, also a new dad. Got a fresh baby at home himself. So yes, cool cameo from a world-class off-road rider. And lots of fun shenanigans and goings on in that episode. So we don't want to
give it away, but Was it easier or not easier for him to ride a dirt bike with a baby strapped to it?
Well, it depends, as it turns out, where the baby is strapped, because we did some experimenting and it makes a big difference, it turns out, both for his safety and the safety of the baby. I suppose that's all we can say. We do hope, I especially here at High Side, Low Side, do hope that you watch CTXP and get a kick out of it.
It was a great episode, and that is where we'll wrap that one up. If you haven't seen it, go check out Revzilla's YouTube channel for the Babies on Bikes episode of CTXP.
I think that's probably enough self-promotion for now, right, Spurge? Like that was good. I appreciate you sort of like throwing me a bone there with my with my YouTube show or whatever.
This whole podcast is self-promotion, if we're being honest.
That's pretty much true, isn't it?
Yeah. We get to do this for a living, people. So thanks to Motul for making this possible. And thanks to all of you for tuning in. I will say, so, and I don't know if we were supposed to, I think we're supposed to save this. So actually, you know what? I'm going to save this little piece of banter until we get to the comment section, because we have some comments about how people felt about the trivia episode. This is the first episode that Zach and I are recording since then, but we're going to save that for a little bit later. For right now, there is no guest today. It is just Zach Quartz and myself going toe-to-toe in a discussion around horsepower. And this actually started from a previous episode of High Side, Low Side, where at the beginning of Season 8, we had Lance Oliver on. We were talking about displacement creep and, how big and crazy these engines are getting. Dustin Whelan, then our Common Tread aficionado, Dustin is our associate editor over at Common Tread, wrote an article about displacement creep. You can read all about that article on Common Tread. If you go to Common Tread and just type in displacement creep, you will find the article. And now we're bringing it back around to a full episode on displacement creep and horsepower. I think I would like to, I'm not sure how accurate this is, but I would like to give Dustin, our colleague, Trusty Dustin Whelan, a tip of the cap. Because I think that we talked about this briefly in High Side, Low Side, and then he turned it into an article, and then I read the article, and I thought, well, that's actually pretty good. And he did actual research and collected actual numbers and looked at data from European emissions testing, sanctioning bodies, and so on and so forth. Dustin did a good job with the article, in my opinion, and we realized that it probably had some legs to talk about all of these things. So as a quick kind of... a little taster, a little amuse-bouche, as they say. Yes.
This is sort of what we're talking about. Quick segment from Dustin's article where he says, he points out that the KTM 990 Super Duke, it was the first Super Duke from KTM, the 990 Super Duke, came out in 2005. It had a 999cc V-twin that claimed 120 horsepower and about 74 foot-pounds of torque. KTM just came out with a 2024 990 Duke, no longer the Super Duke, because of course that's bigger now, but the 990 Duke, which has a 990cc engine, I believe, so almost the same size.
Parallel twin.
Parallel twin now, not a V-twin, true. And it is rated at 123 horsepower instead of 120. And the old bike weighed 394 pounds. The new bike, 395 pounds. All of this is to say, this small snapshot from one model, from one brand, shows you that over 20 years, now the mid-size bike is the same size as the flagship was. And there are lots of examples of this, which we'll get into during the podcast, but it made us think, why is this happening? We should explain why it's happening from sort of a factual or as factual as we can get here on High Side, Low Side, why this is actually happening, and then talk about the cultural aspect of it from our point of view. How much horsepower is too much horsepower? What do you actually need? So Spurge, I think we should start with the sort of the reason largely that this is happening, right? Why are engines getting so big, Spurge and Dunbar? Why is there an R1250 GS when there used to be an R1150 and an R1300 GS now? And then there was the Super Duke has just gotten bigger and Ducati Multistradas have just gotten bigger. Like, what's the deal?
So I'm on Dustin's article at the moment, which says, just so we're all clear, I will include a link in this on YouTube, but it's displacement creep. Why do motorcycles keep getting bigger? And he goes, that begs the question, who's the real driver of displacement creep? Is it regulators? Is it manufacturers? Or is it customers? The answer is yes.
Great line. Great line.
So why do engines keep getting bigger? Well, you have European emissions regulations that are driving a lot of this, and so they're making more displacement to be able to have engines make the same or a little bit more power while then also meeting emissions regulations. You have customers who the idea historically has always been a little bit more powerful, a little bit more powerful, a little bit more powerful.
Bigger is a little better.
We can talk about the whole horsepower wars of the Japanese manufacturers of the 90s into the 2000s, the gentleman's agreement, all of that, which if you don't know what we're talking about, we can get into that a little bit later in the podcast. And then you have, manufacturers. And the manufacturer's customer goes play and play. Like the manufacturers are doing the horsepower war thing because that's what the customers are looking for and that's what they're buying and they want to have the bragging rights. And I think it all comes into play. And I think that's really what the point of Dustin's article was. But I think a lot of it is around the emissions piece from a current standard.
Yes. So to kind of like the good description, Spurge, to try and recap what Spurgeon said, I think that to boil it down as simply as I can, or I'll try, basically, as emissions regulations get tighter and fewer particulates are allowed to go out the exhaust of a motorcycle, it often makes sense or it is a solution for a motorcycle company to make the engine a little bit bigger. Then the power output can be approximately the same with fewer particulates coming out the pipe because the power comes at a lower RPM or other variables as well. So that's what manufacturers have been and are reaching for sometimes when an engine gets a little bit bigger. Doesn't necessarily have anything to do with marketing or new model or anything like that, though that does play a part, as you pointed out, Spurge. But that's kind of, I think, at the core of why emissions regulations oddly force engines to be bigger or contribute to engines being bigger.
And a lot of this is based on Euro standards because that's the main.
Yes.
That I would say that's probably the strictest of some of the standards that are out there right now.
So if you hear us
currently,
sorry to interrupt, Serge, but if you hear us say Euro 4, Euro 5, Euro 6, that's what we're talking about. Euro 5, Euro 6. These are European regulations for emissions that often dictate other markets because the European market is so big.
Yep. And we're currently, just so we're all on the same page, we're currently on, I think it's Euro 5 plus for motorcycles.
Right.
And the automotive industry is going into, I believe, Euro 7. And there was a point that Dustin kind of addressed in his article that the assumption is going to be Euro 6 motorcycle standards will be somewhere in line with what current Euro 7 is holding true for cars. So it's not exactly the same for cars and for motorcycles either. There is some differentiation there.
Right. So that covers to some extent why the sort of like I said, I don't know if factual is the right word, but the sort of like science behind why engines are getting bigger.
Let me ask you a question around this, because this was actually one of the comments that came through on the article. How do you feel, and some people, I imagine, feel very strongly about this. How do you feel about the fact that the motorcycles that we get in America are largely beholden to a European emission standard versus, an American standard? And obviously you're in California, so the California, you have your own set of regulations different than the rest of the country.
How do I feel about it? I guess, I don't know. I mean, I guess I feel conflicted in some ways because you'd want the regulations like levied on the motorcycle that you are riding to be based on the place that you live, not some other place. So you could feel sort of hard done by that if you want to. On the other hand, I get why motorcycle manufacturers would combine those things, right? I understand why you'd want to build a bike that works for multiple markets, and you don't want to build a different exhaust pipe for Iowa than you build for Texas, than you build for Belgium, than you build for New South Wales in Australia. You know what I mean? Like that sounds like a complete hornet's nest. So I think that, having some sort of consistency makes sense. What I will say that annoys me is that there's often a there's often sort of like a tag put on Euro standards, like, oh, that's really holding back motorcycles sometimes for the US market, for example. But then a lot of times European models will have more horsepower than the American model, you know, because of noise emissions. I think that's a whole separate kind of ball of wax. But the noise emissions thing is another thing. And that makes it on the surface extra confusing, right? You're sort of like, oh, we're being like, why, when I buy a bike in Georgia or in Wisconsin or in Texas or in Oregon, do I have a bike that was sort of dictated by Euro 5 standards? That doesn't make any sense. But then also my R1 makes less horsepower than if I bought it in whatever, I don't know, in Europe somewhere, which is like, it feels like the worst of both worlds in some ways, right? What's your take on it? Do you have strong feelings about how these things are dictated?
I just wanted to kind of, I mean, I think it's important for everyone out there complaining about that, you know, and there were definitely a lot of people that were like, I think it's BS that my motorcycle in Iowa has to, you know, adhere to some standard for Germany. Economy of scale. Motorcycles are such a small percentile of vehicles on the road in developed countries when compared to cars and automobiles. So for these high dollar, expensive, complex machines, the only way to make them affordable for the average person is that you have to have them meet some kind of unified standard. Mm-hmm. And you're already hitting on the fact that there are different noise regulations in America, so they already have to tweak different things within the exhaust system. But I think that we need to keep in mind that by picking the most stringent of the standards and saying this is what we're going to go for, you now can produce a motorcycle that's more affordable because it's essentially 99% or 95% the same across the board.
And who doesn't want it to be more affordable, Spurge? Who doesn't like that?
Exactly, because if all the same people that were sitting there complaining about the fact that their, you know, BMW 1350 GS is a pile of garbage and I only need a, you know, 1250 and I don't need these extra 100 cc's to adhere to some standard, but now all of a sudden, cool, we'll give you the 1250. It's going to be, you know, it's not going to meet Euro 5, but now it's a $40,000 motorcycle. There'd be a lot of BMW riders out there being like, what are you doing to me? Just give me the 1350 that Europe has. That's what I want. You know, so these manufacturers are never going to win. And I think it's important to note that I think that they are doing the best job they can of producing the best motorcycle with the most power for the least amount of money.
And that's actually a good thing to remember over the course of this discussion is that the free market, like as the motorcycle industry is, drives a lot of that anyway, right? You know, like Kawasaki can't just hike up prices and say, yeah, it's $25,000 for Versus 650 now because everyone will just buy a Yamaha or whatever. So there's already competition, and I think it's fair to remember that when we all as motorcyclists complain about whatever technology being laid into a bike or prices going up or a combination of the two or whatever. So
could you imagine how much you'd have to throw onto a Kawasaki Versys 650 to make it $25,000?
You know, one of our friends, Spencer Robert, might argue that a Versys 650 is worth $25,000 as it is. Tremendous motorcycle.
Well, if we watch this podcast in about 10 years and inflation keeps going the way it's going, it might just be a $25,000 motorcycle.
That's true. So the next thing we wanted to talk about before we dive into our personal feelings about how much horsepower is too much, because I think that to some extent is the core of this conversation, or it's a large facet of it, is the difference between displacement and horsepower, right, Spurge? Like there is a common misunderstanding, I think.
Misconception?
About, right, sure. Misperception, misundereducation.
Yeah.
I don't know.
It's all wrong.
Of a motorcycle engine being a certain size, and then that meaning that it is bigger, badder, faster. So as a sort of tangential point to the fact that motorcycle engines are getting bigger in some cases only to maintain the amount of horsepower that they have had historically within that model line, it's also important to remember that, say, a Honda CBR 600 has a much smaller engine, displacement-wise, than a Triumph Speed Twin 900, for example. The Triumph being a 900, the Honda being a 600, just so you're following along. But a Triumph Speed Twin 900 is a much more gentle, friendly, easy motorcycle to ride than a Honda CBR 600 because of myriad reasons. The Triumph is a twin. It's lopier. It's doesn't rev as high, so on and so forth. But it is also important to remember that, I think, Spurgeon, we wanted to call that out during the process of this podcast, that the size of the engine doesn't necessarily have anything to do with how much horsepower it makes. And that is a broader understanding that people need to have in the context of the discussion of engines getting bigger.
Yeah, I think we've talked about this before on the podcast. It's something that comes up with beginners a lot. It's something that it's one of the more popular questions that I used to get back in my dealership days. It's questions that we see, still coming in on Comment Chart articles.
Yep.
The point that we're trying to make is that that displacement isn't the only measure of power. Is it liquid cooled? How many cylinders does it have? How are those cylinders configured? Zack used an example with a 600 versus a 900. Look at a GSXR 750 and a Honda Shadow 750. Both are 750, roughly 750 cc's.
Yep.
The Honda Shadow is a 2-cylinder V-twin that makes roughly, 45 to 50 horsepower. And the Gixxer 750 is an inline-4, liquid-cooled, race-bred bike that makes roughly, 125 horsepower.
130,
so
who knows, something like that, whatever.
Just completely different. So I think as we're going through this conversation, while a lot of this is going to focus on displacement as the conversation starter, we are going to get into some of this where I think having that fundamental understanding is going to be key.
Yes, indeed. Okay. Have we dotted some I's and crossed some T's, Spurgeon? And can we dive into this question of how much horsepower is too much horsepower? Are you ready?
I'm ready. I'm locked. I've got notes on a page.
You've got a mustache on your upper lip that is ready to strain some soup.
It was hiding behind a beard. I trimmed the beard down and look what was there. My God. Alrighty. So we're going to talk about this in the realm of 4 categories. Is that what we decided?
Yeah, sure. Whatever. We'll see where the conversation takes us. But yes.
Okay. So let's go back to your first example. Mm-hmm. Let's just kick this off with how much horsepower do you need personally? And let's make this example. The Duke that you talked about earlier. Take a 2010 KTM Super Duke 990.
Okay.
Is that about the right year?
Sure, yeah.
I'm
08, 09, whatever.
Yeah,
sure. Yeah,
like
whatever.
And that makes 120 horsepower. Compare that to a brand new KTM Duke 990 parallel twin that makes 120-ish horsepower, whatever. Which one is going to be more fun? And well, that's not true. Let's not say fun. Which one is going to be easier to ride?
Right. Good point. I know what you're driving
because
at here.
I remember getting on when I was working at the dealership in 2012. I got my first ride on a used Super Duke 990, and it scared the poop out of me. Like it was unlike anything I'd ever ridden. It was untamable. It was like just insane.
Right.
And if you get on a 990 Duke on the dealership floor right now, it feels much more well-mannered.
Sure.
Why is that?
And to be clear, I don't think either one of us have ridden a new 990 Duke for 2024, but it will almost certainly be tamer and more reasonable. And what Spurgeon's driving at here is that even though the outright horsepower numbers are the same, motorcycles have largely become easier to ride, and an average 1000cc V-twin from 20 or 25 years ago is probably a little bit more ornery and difficult and peaky embattled maybe than a bike now, which is sort of designed to have 120 horsepower, say, eventually, but to deliver those 120 horsepower in a way that is very linear and understandable and and kind of practical and easier to use.
And
so,
you've got ABS, you've got
Right.
19,000 modes of traction control, you've got lean angle sensor traction control, you've got lean angle sensitive ABS, you've got rider modes, you've got throttle modes, you can do engine braking, you can retard the engine braking, you have so many electronics on a motorcycle today that did not exist 10 or 15 years ago, and it makes it feel completely differently. Just a quick note to Zach's point about 1,000 cc V twin. Again, just reiterating, the V twin that was in the original Super Duke that we talked about was a liquid cooled race bred V twin, not the same as what you would have found in like a Harley Davidson V twin of a similar era. That's all.
That's true. That is true. And yes, that original KTM Super Duke did have like a reputation for like wheeling and cracking your crotch against the tank when you shut the throttle. And I think it was the first generation of V twin that was fuel injected at whatever point. And early fuel injection was sometimes not great, especially from European manufacturers. Anyway, the point is, there's a lot to be said about how bikes have developed. And I guess to explore another branch on that tree, Spurgeon, does that make displacement creep more reasonable? Like you have a 1390 Super Duke now, or you have a BMW R1300 GS, which seems unfathomably huge to anyone who owned an R100 GS, which was a 1,000cc air-cooled bike in the 80s that was, by all accounts, especially by modern standards, pretty tame. So 1300 just seems berserk, and 100 and whatever horsepower seems berserk. But does all of the control that has been issued and sort of like laid out over motorcycling in general make it more reasonable? Like, does that justify it, basically? Or do you think it's a reaction to engines getting big?
No, I think this is actually, I'm going to make a reference to Dylan Code. Dylan Code, son of Keith Code, runs California Superbike School. And when I first took my very first California Superbike School class that I went to years ago, I asked Dylan, I said, you're using these BMW S1000RRs. You got guys like me coming in, girls like you have people coming in saying, I'm newer to track riding. I'm just here to get better. And you're going to stick me on what is arguably at the time one of the fastest production motorcycles that they made. Why are you doing this?
Good question.
And he actually said when they had gone from the Kawasaki ZX, I think they were using like ZX7s for a while. When they went to the BMW from Kawasaki, their crash rate dropped drastically. The bikes were easier for people to learn on. They were advancing quicker because they were an easier bike to ride because of all those additional, rider's aids and different safety mechanisms. The point that I'm going to make to you is you just got off the brand new S1000R from BMW. If I remember from our conversation correctly,
M1000R.
I'm sorry, M1000R.
This is the hopped up version of the S1000 single R,
205 horsepower.
Yes. Right.
Like there were comments in your article from people being like, that's just too much power. You're going to hurt yourself, Zachary. You don't need that much power in a motorcycle. Now, let me ask you a question. Just coming off of M1000R, 205 horsepower, what do you think would be easier for you to ride? An M1000R, which is one of the fastest motorcycles you can get out there, at least one of the fastest naked bikes you can get out there right now.
Right.
Or let's go back in time to 1996, and Honda introduces the Blackbird, the CBR 1100 Blackbird, which was like the fastest production motorcycle in 1996, made a whopping 164 horsepower. Just off the top of your head, and I know that you might not have ridden a Blackbird.
Right.
What do you think is going to feel faster to you and or harder to ride? The Blackbird or the BMW?
Right. Good question. I mean, I think I see what you're driving at here. I would say that I've never ridden a Blackbird. I've never ridden a CBR 1100 double X, I think, wasn't that? CBR 1100 XX. Yeah. Blackbird. But I suspect that to ride around on the street, to ride to work or take a Sunday ride and cruise up some twisty roads, it's probably pretty reasonable and like not outrageous. However, if you were to try to ride those 164 horsepower around a racetrack, the reason it would be hard to ride wouldn't be that it doesn't have enough, or the reason it would be slower than the BMW is not that it doesn't have enough horsepower. It would be that it feels unruly and there's no safety systems in place to sort of like save you from all that horsepower. And it would be heavy and difficult. And I think that's kind of an interesting, I don't know, an interesting thing to think about. That it would
it's all the things around the engine that make a motorcycle as a total easier to ride, despite the fact that horsepower numbers have gotten increasingly high.
And that was the upshot of my article about the M1000R. Actually, is that the horsepower of the claimed horsepower of 205 horsepower is sort of like a easily measurable and stunning thing to say, right? Oh, it's 205 horsepower. But actually, the thing that makes that bike so good is everything else, because the 205 horsepower has asked all of the other BMW engineers outside the engine department to make the bike as good as it needs to be. It has to be precise. The brakes have to be good. It has to turn well. It has to be stable at high speed because it has all of this horsepower on tap. So even if you took that bike, the 200 horsepower bike, and if you just snapped your fingers and gave it 100 horsepower, it would still be pretty magical to ride because of everything else that's so good about it. But I don't want to get too distracted about that because we're going to talk about riding on the track later in our discussion. What I want to do right now, Spurgeon, if you don't mind, is pivot to off-road.
Yeah.
You're a fella who likes an off-road ride. You have an enduro motorcycle in your garage, and you and I have ridden dirt bikes together. This is a totally different arena to play in when you're riding on trails, you're riding dirt roads, whether it's a dual sport or you have an enduro, off-road race bike, whatever. I guess outside of, true motocross or supercross or something where you're hitting jumps, but sort of like off-road competition, off-road riding, dual sport riding. What's the right amount of horsepower for you? And what is too much?
I don't even know how much horsepower my 350 makes. So I have a 2018 KTM 350 EXCF. My bike is not stock. I have
obviously not.
I have an ECU off of a different KTM on it. I have.
Oh, I see.
So it makes more power than the stock bike.
Okay.
But my point in saying that is that it's too much power. Like,
is it now?
Here's the deal.
Okay.
KTM 350. You actually we were on a trip together where you got to ride the Husky version of that.
Yeah. Right.
That was not uncorked. You rode the bone stock version.
Yeah.
And
the old FE 350.
You got it.
Mm-hmm.
I am remembering back to a time when I rode my friend Liz's. Liz Canary is somebody that we've talked about before on the podcast. She has done some articles for us on Common Tread. She had a 250 XCF. And for a lot of what we do from a racing standpoint on the East Coast is really tight, narrow single track. And the problem that I have with the 350 is that the throttle is so sensitive that, unless you are a true professional rider, it can get away from you very quickly. And then you're going to hit a tree and you're going to hurt yourself like I have done many times. I remember when I went and tried Liz's 250 and we swapped bikes, I could go completely wide open on the throttle and push it so much harder and have so much more fun with it that it was almost easier to ride. So it's not that I could hit whoops the same way. It's not that I could jump it the same way. Because for all that stuff, the 350 is magical. But for actually riding faster in tight single track terrain, the bike with less power was an easier bike to ride, in my humblest of opinions.
Right. So a couple clarifications around that point, which I think is interesting. One, you said that bike, ultimately your 350, kind of feels like it has too much power. Comparing it to Liz's 250, which was better. Quick clarification there. Those are both 4-stroke liquid-cooled single-cylinder engines. So like playing in the same field there. So 250 is sort of like on a sort of linear scale that much smaller than the 350. When we rode the 350s, you and I, on that trip around Grand Canyon last fall, we were in like we're in Arizona on big fire roads, and the 350 doesn't feel too fast there. Agreed? Because we're going 55 or 60 miles an hour, and most of the trails are pretty open. We didn't do a lot of like really tight woods riding or anything like that, so I think it felt much more reasonable. Would you agree?
Yeah, it's the reason
so the
that
environment has something to do with it.
Exactly. A lot of the reason that you see, you're out in Southern California, a lot of the desert racers in Southern California will go up to like the 500, which is the same configuration, 4-stroke, liquid cooled. They make a 450 and a 500 variant.
Right.
But for that, a lot of the folks will be jumping up to a 500 because it's wide open. You're just going as fast as you can, ripping across the desert.
Right.
So
it sounds like, to get back to my question to you, how much horsepower is too much? You said you don't know exactly how much your 350 makes.
I think the 350 in stock form for 2024, based on a recent quick Google search that I made, makes roughly 50 horsepower. So the 350 in 24 is a 50 horsepower motorcycle.
Approximately. And you would say for your type of riding, East Coast woods riding that you do, 50 horsepower might be a little bit too much. Something more like 40, 35 or 40, that might be like a more reasonable amount of power.
Yeah,
would you say?
I think if I'm remembering correctly, and again, this is hard because yes, let's just simplify this, and I'm not going to get into the
there's
actual.
So many variables here. Let's just try and keep it.
I would say 35 to 40 horsepower is probably a little bit more appropriate for someone that's riding in tighter terrain.
Right, and I will say, for my piece on this off-road bit, that I agree. I think every time I've ridden a 350 KTM or 350 Husky 350 KTM as the the bike that you have essentially has been on the west of the Mississippi. It's been in a more open terrain, and though I have ridden it in the Sierra and in some sort of wooded trails, and I remember thinking the 350 is like really, really nice amount of power. Every time I ride I've ridden a 500 KTM, for example, or even to some extent that Honda 450 RL or RX or whatever they're calling it. Now it feels like too much for me. Like I'm not a good enough rider off road to really take advantage of all that. And when I ride smaller bikes with less horsepower, with more like 20, 25, 30 horsepower, I think, this isn't really enough for me. So it sounds like we're on kind of the same page. And I do think it's, just to get back to the whole displacement does not equal horsepower, I have a story from when I was, I don't know, late teen, like 19, 20 years old, something like that. And I went dirt bike riding with a friend, and he had two Honda 2-strokes. One was a Honda CR 125 and one was a Honda CR 250. And this was around the time that I was racing 600 Super Sport at a local club. So I was racing an R6 or a GSX R600 or something like that, 100 and something horsepower, 600cc Super Sport bike, a relatively fast vehicle in our society. Got on this 250 2-stroke motocross bike, and I flicked myself off it in a big way. It was way, way, way too much. It makes a lot less horsepower than an R6 or some sort of 600 Super Sport street bike, obviously. But when you try to confine that horsepower to a trail, or you deliver that horsepower in kind of a violent way, as 2-stroke dirt bikes can do, it was too much, which I just think is it's an endlessly interesting piece along this sliding scale of what is too much and what is not enough,
Well, it gets back to what we talked about originally, where you can't just look at displacement. And I'll tell a short anecdote here just around the dirt off-road segment, where when we were getting my wife, Nicole, her first off-road bike, she wanted to come out and ride in the Pine Barrens with us.
Yep.
I was sending her links to Kawasaki KLX 230Ls, and, which is a little 4-stroke, very manageable,
air-cooled,
small,
fairly tame.
Yes,
right. Sort of like a 3/4 size motorcycle or whatever.
Yep.
Yeah.
And so she saw the number. She saw the 230, and then she started sending me Craigslist ads for like used 250 2-stroke bikes from like the 90s. And she's like, "Oh, this one's cute. I like this one." I'm like, "That bike will kill you. It is not. That is not beginner friendly." And I think it's the difference between a 4-stroke and a 2-stroke is an entirely different podcast.
It is a whole different podcast. Good point, Spurge.
But I will say, for off-road, the new, I had mentioned Liz Canary a second ago around racing her 250. She has recently moved to a 300 two-stroke, and the evolutions that two-strokes and a KTM 300 two-stroke, but the evolution that KTM specifically has made with their two-stroke motorcycles and where the power is manageable and how they can tune them is completely different, and it changes engine braking and all this other stuff, which again, it's not just about displacement, especially off-road when you're getting into how fast can you go on this motorcycle.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, Airy has an older 300 two-stroke that I've ridden, and it's like a total sweetheart. And if you told someone in 1985, like, oh, I've got a 300cc two-stroke dirt bike, they'd be like, well, you better be a professional because that thing's going to try to murder you.
Yeah.
It's a whole very different evolution and very interesting. I'd like to move on.
Yep.
To something that's like maybe a little bit more in our wheelhouse here on high side, low side, though we do like riding off-road, you especially. And that's a sort of a track bike, a sport bike.
Right so up your alley. You were just talking about your CBR 600.
Talking about CBR 600s and R6s and GSXRs and the M1000 and blah, blah, blah. So, Spurgeon Dunbar, if you're going to have a motorcycle to go to a racetrack to do track days or like, say, club racing, whatever, you're going to ride around a closed course on pavement with your knee pucks on, you're going to drag your knee, and you're going to be just like the famous Valentino Rossi, blah, blah, blah. What motorcycle are you choosing? Well, yeah. What motorcycle are you choosing, but why are you choosing it for that horsepower, and like how much horsepower is right and how much is too much?
Sure. So just to clarify for our audience, whilst I am doing my best on a racetrack to maybe potentially get my knee on the ground, Zach Quartz is, trying to keep his elbow from wearing through. So Zach and I are at two different levels on a racetrack, and Zach is someone that's been very inspirational to me. Zach and Ari both have been very kind in helping me feel like I want to go faster. But we are at two different levels on the playing field. I am probably, when I go to a track day, I am right up the intermediate alley. So for those of you that have never done a track day before, there's usually, and Zach, correct me if I'm wrong, if this is different for you on the West Coast, we have like C group, which is beginner.
Yep.
We have B group, which is intermediate riders. And then we have A group, which is like you're doing club racing on the weekends and you're just there to try and, put down fast lap times and, go as hard as you can go.
That's a good breakdown.
I'm a B group person, like smack dab in the middle. So for me, I've often touted, I've had a lot of fun on like a Ninja 400. Bike makes about 45 horsepower. I can go on a bone stock Ninja 400 and have a great time. However, NJMP is my local racetrack, long straightaway. There are times
New Jersey Motorsports Park, for those of you not familiar.
Thank you very much. On the straightaway there's times where I'm like, I wish I had a little bit more. I have done NJMP on an S1000RR, and I've had no need to take it out of rain mode, which keeps me comfortably at 145 horsepower. I'm somewhere in the middle of that. I think my ideal track bike would be somewhere between like an SV650, which is about 75 horsepower.
Sure, yeah.
And the top end would be something like a Street Triple RS, which is like 120 horsepower, but with all the extra suspension and rider aids, which make it easier for someone like myself to ride it. So I think that range of, I do not need more than 125 horsepower for me. I can't use it. It scares me. I've done it, but like I can't push the bike to its fullest potential.
Right.
And much like I was talking about with Liz Canari's 250, I really like getting into, I can snap that throttle all the way back and feel like I am using the motorcycle versus holding on for dear life.
Right.
So for me, that's my limit. What about yourself?
Well, I just want to pause for a moment and say it's telling, it's interesting that you would potentially be happy with approximately the same amount of horsepower off-road as on a track. If you had 45, 50 horsepower in both cases, you're like, a little too much for the dirt, not quite enough for a pavement, but it's about right.
Yeah.
So my point is,
I could have a lot of fun on a Ninja 400, both on or off-road.
Yeah. As Patrick Garvin did in our CTSP episode. Yeah. Well, I think that's a good call out. And I would say that I have had just a knee slapping good time on a racetrack on a Ninja 400 also. Though I am a more advanced track rider than Spurgeon, for example, but that is a terrifically fun motorcycle to ride around a racetrack, and often other motorcycles in that approximate category can be as well. As for the question of how much horsepower is too much for me on a racetrack, this is a tricky one. And I'll answer it in two different ways. The first thing I'll say is that I don't think I've never ridden a motorcycle that felt too fast on a racetrack. I've never had,
Wow.
I can remember being overwhelmed by how much horsepower a bike has in a certain situation over my riding career. Like the first time I rode a GSXR 1000 on a track was just sort of like a track day, and I'd never ridden a 1000cc sport bike before, and someone's like, "Oh, take it out." I was doing instructing at a track day, and I remember I went down the straightaway the first time, and I was like, "Wow, I can't believe they sell these things to people." Anyway, I do remember that at some point, but at the point I am right now in my riding career, every time I've ever ridden a bike that's really, really fast, I've always just thought, I wish it was faster. I wish I could just go faster, because I'm kind of a racer at heart and I really want that. And I do ride motorcycles that are too good for me. You know, I mean, every time I ride a like Panigale V4R or I don't know, like a truly sort of race prepped 1000cc bike, I'm sort of like, I'm not getting the most out of this bike. I can tell. Like I don't have the skill to get all of the power out of this bike. That doesn't mean I don't have fun trying. So that's the one answer. The one answer is sort of like, I want I want all the horsepowers. And I think that in most cases, I have the skills to cope with it. And I like that. But I was talking to Ari about this the other day. Ari and I are very comparable riding skill on a racetrack, sort of like, on most days, can't tell the difference as far as who's faster around a track on the same bike. I said to him, if you were going to go racing right now with your own money, with your own, like, you know, whatever, you were just going to go racing for fun, what bike would you pick? And we had this discussion, and the upshot was, for both of us, we both said some sort of middleweight twin bike. So SV650, MT07R, Aprilia RS660, these liquid cooled 4-stroke twin cylinder, mid-sized street bikes that when transformed into racing trim are, you know, whatever, probably 80 horsepower, 75 or 80 horsepower, and they're a little bit lighter, and you get better suspension and better brakes, so they handle really nicely. But that's the amount of horsepower that I would probably want if I was going to do that all the time, because that's realistically my level. That's a bike where I can really hammer it and feel like I'm squeezing the most out of the bike and have a good time. I think kind of similar to what you were saying about you on a Ninja 400 and SV or something like that.
Yeah, it's interesting. I was expecting you to go bigger, because I do know that your skill level surpasses mine, and I know that you have an addiction for speed that surpasses mine too. Right. So I was expecting you to be in the upper ranges. I'm surprised that it turns out that you're a little bit more of a conservative than I thought.
Well, I would like to circle back to a point that we often kind of harp on as quote unquote, you know, experts or old hands or whatever, veterans, perhaps to some extent of motorcycle riding and the industry. When I see some, you know, we often preach that we should get a smaller bike if you're going to go to a track day. On the topic of going to the racetrack to enhance your skills or to have fun or whatever, we often say, get a small sport bike or get a mid-sized sport bike and don't overdo it. I think that that's true 100%. If you want your skills to get better, if you want to get better at going through corners or, controlling the bike and really getting the most out of you want your racing lines to be really good, that's the way to do it. I do understand why people get fast bikes to go to the racetrack, because that's the place that you can experience it, right? That's the place that you can.
It's a place that you should experience it.
Right, exactly. If you have a 150 or 200 horsepower bike, riding it on the road makes even less sense, which we'll get into. But if you want to go to NJMP, like, as Spurgeon did, or you want to go to a Laguna Seca track day on the West Coast, or you want to go to whatever other racetrack around the country, around the world.
Sonoma Raceway, one of Ari Henning's favorites.
That's right. Sonoma's not a great place for a big bike. There's no real straightaway. But the point is, you want to really like stretch the bike's legs. You know, you want to open the throttle and feel what it's like for the thing to pull up to red line in third and fourth gear and go 100 and something miles an hour. I get it. Because that's like you work hard Monday through Friday. You bought this expensive, fast motorcycle and you want to feel what it can do. You don't want a piddly little 45 horsepower Ninja 400 to make yourself a quote unquote better rider.
This is like
I understand.
a Bruce Springsteen song in writing. My gosh, it is great. But let me ask you a question here. So like part of my rationale for my pick, right? Like, so when I say SV650,
yeah,
I'm not talking about going and dropping down, 8 or 9 or 10 grand. I don't know what the new ones cost on a brand new one. I think part of the reason that I like an SV650 is that you can go buy a track prepped SV650 with a Gixxer front end on it for $3,000, $4,000, and you're not afraid to scratch it up because somebody already did that. Like, I think for me on the track, like what intimidates me about a $15,000 or $20,000 motorcycle, which are typically the ones that are making 170 or 180 horsepower, it's not necessarily even the horsepower. It's that, like, if I wad this thing up, like, that's a lot of money. So I think
that's fair.
I am more comfortable pushing myself if I am less worried about the damage that will be incurred with the motorcycle. Like when I low-sided the hell out of a Ninja 400 and I was just watching it slide across the track and I was like, oh, this isn't going to be that bad. And then it caught the curbing and started flipping end over end. And I was like, oh no, this is going to be a lot worse than I thought. But
ultimately it's a $5,000 bike. So,
Exactly.
Right.
Some duct tape and some woodcraft parts that I bought at the track. And I was back out for the afternoon sessions, So,
totally, man. Totally. Yeah, I think that's fair. I think that's a good call out, is sort of like there are other factors with a high horsepower bike that can be intimidating aside from the horsepower, like the financial commitment or the how fast they burn up tires or whatever. Again,
so I want to take this conversation and we're going to take it from the racetrack back to the street.
Yes,
but before we
do
do that, let's get in a word from our sponsor, Motul.
Giddy up. Yeah, right. We're back here talking about horsepowers. Zack and Spurg on high side, low side. Where were we, Spurg? We were talking about how much horsepower do you need personally, and we talked about off-road riding, dirt bikes. We talked about track riding, where you're dragging knees and hopefully not any other parts of your body. So now we'd like to move on.
Coming from the guy wearing holes in his elbow pads over here.
Whatever. ADV bikes. This is an area that is near and dear to your heart, Spurgeon Dunbar. So I'm very curious to hear you say, because the ADV category is obviously adventure touring is sort of what ADV stands for. There are many, many different facets of ADV bikes. There are sort of on-road only bikes. There are sort of quasi off-road styled motorcycles, but are really only street bikes. And then there are sort of like hardcore off-roady adventure bikes like the one that Spurgeon has. And then there's also small ones and large ones and mid-sized ones and whatever. So there's just a lot of options. And I'm curious, Spurgeon, when it comes to an adventure motorcycle, I know you own one, but break down for us why you own the one that you do. And again, how much horsepower is the right amount, you think, and how much is too much?
So I originally, the most horsepower I ever had out of any of my adventure bikes was the 1090 that I owned. And that was claimed I think 125 horsepower.
Oh, really? That made that made more horsepower than your bike now.
It does. Yeah. I stepped down. I think the 890 is claimed somewhere around 110 maybe.
Okay.
Give or take. I stepped down in displacement because the 890 was significantly lighter, like 50, 60 pounds-ish lighter.
Gotcha.
And it was a better suspension. It was a better all-around bike. You can for riding off-road, you could go faster than you could with the 1090 in theory, depending on your off-road ability.
Right.
There's definitely days where I miss the vibe of the 1090. Like there was something about having a big V-twin engine with an opened up intake and the feeling of just hitting the throttle and that bike just got sideways. The problem with too much horsepower in an adventure bike that you're taking off road is that at a certain point, you're not making traction, you're just breaking traction. And that rear wheel just breaks loose and spins sideways, and then you're not going in the direction you want to go. So I think if you're using your adventure bike off-road, there's definitely such a thing as too much horsepower. It becomes unruly. Then you get into this debate with people about oh, well, I want to put my significant other on the back. I want to haul a bunch of stuff. 890 is not enough power. We had this conversation with Ryan from Fort 9, who was asking about the dimensions of certain people's significant others.
Asking about Americans in general.
Exactly. I guess my big thing with an adventure bike is there is truly a balance here. There is truly a point where, too much power, if you're using it on and off road, can push in a negative direction. I find that right around the 100 to 125 horsepower range is what is the most comfortable for me. And keeping in mind that oftentimes when you get a little bit smaller in displacement, typically there's a weight correlation there. So typically if you're going a little bit smaller in displacement, in theory, you're going a little bit lighter as well.
You're going to get a smaller bike. Right. Yeah. Yeah, that's fair. I guess I want to be thoughtful about how I ask this next question. I know a lot of what you like about your particular adventure bike that you own, which is the KTM 890 Adventure R Rally, correct?
Yep, correct.
Is that it has particularly advanced and expensive and sophisticated suspension. So, and you're a tall glass of water yourself, and not a light glass of water. I think you would also agree. So having really nice suspension
depends on what you say is heavy, Zach. I mean, it's all relative. I'm
all relative.
heavier than you. I'm heavier than you. So you're right. Yes.
We'll have to ask Ryan Fortnine what qualifies as heavy. So basically, the chassis of the bike, similar to what I was saying about that BMW M1000R, the chassis of your 890 Rally is really a lot of what you like about it. So how little horsepower would you think would be acceptable for that bike to have for you to still be satisfied with it to use as an adventure bike? Like, what if it had
question.
75 horsepower?
I would be completely happy with that. I think this gets back to when we did the a couple of seasons ago, we did the build your crazy favorite adventure bike.
Right.
I would be completely happy with the Tenere 700 engine in my KTM chassis.
Okay.
I think that's actually in some ways it's a better engine, just in its usability, in its fueling, in the way that the power kind of comes on and delivers a little bit. There is something about the 890 when it wakes up where it definitely is a lot more hair raising than the Tenere 700 engine is,
and that can be fun.
But it gets back to going back to the original point that started about this, where you can go higher in displacement, and that fixes certain things from an emission standpoint. Like my 1090, the fueling and the throttle control on that bike as it related back to the engine, the clutch as it related back to the engine made the power much more fun and usable. Like it felt more connected to the engine in the way that it all worked. Whereas the 890 does feel a little bit disconnected with all the electronics on it the relationship of the engine. And so for me, that's what I like about the Yamaha engine, is that even though it's less power, there's a more connected feeling to some of that. And I think so that's kind of where that comes into play.
Okay.
But I would have no problem. I would have no problem with 70 horsepower, putting Nicole in the back, putting a bunch of luggage on it, and taking a cross-country trip if we're going to do that.
Right.
Like I think 70 horsepower is plenty for whether you're using your adventure bike for street touring or you're using your adventure bike for off-road. Now, my question for you, Zach.
Yeah.
And we've heard a lot of people talk about this. People say that 70 horsepower is too much. People say that if you're riding an adventure bike, why aren't we getting 450 adventure bikes? Why hasn't Kawasaki put a 450 cc engine in their Versys 300? Like, is there a case to be made for a smaller displacement bike? And is that what you're looking for in your adventure motorcycle?
It's a good question. It's a good question. Maybe my case is really specific. I think what you're saying makes total sense. Like your KTM is probably the most advanced and sophisticated off-road weapon, or one of the most sophisticated off-road weapons in the ADV category, like as far as suspension and brakes and electronic, and like it's a pretty rugged, gnarly off-road bike, considering it's an adventure touring bike and ultimately it's a street bike.
Thank you for saying that.
And I think, right, I know. Well, you bought it for a reason, so I can respect that. So I think that, yeah, having that chassis with a little bit with less horsepower, I think I'd be fine. I agree. 70 horsepower, 75 horsepower, that'd be fine. And you'd be fine for a touring bike. You'd be fine for an off-road bike. You'd be fine. It'd be great. I think that where my ADV kind of mind goes is I'm not a very good off-road rider. And so I often find myself thinking, well, having a big bike off-road is sort of like fine with me.
Pause for 1 second. Because I appreciate your being humble.
Yeah.
But you're a pretty good off-road rider as it relates to adventure bikes.
I think I'm a pretty good adventure bike off-road rider. Like, if you
go.
give me a 550-pound GS and ask me to go down a dirt road, you might be impressed with what I can do. If you give me a 450 dirt bike and ask me to go down a trail, you will not be very impressed with what I can do. So, yeah, the bike.
Thank you for clarifying.
The context does matter, and I guess that's partly what I was reaching for. Sort of like, I'm 6'2" and 200 pounds, and I'm sort of like on the larger side for. I'm above average for a human being in the United States, and I think having a big, heavy bike with a lot of horsepower, to me, on the street can sometimes make it feel more engaging and fun, and make it more interesting to ride as a street bike. And then when I ride it as a dirt bike, I'm like, well, I'm not that great at riding a pure dirt bike anyway. So riding a bigger, heavier ADV down a dirt road or a trail or something like that is kind of fine with me. I don't need it to be, and similar to what you said about, or what we said about your KTM being, so sophisticated, but actually probably having more horsepower than it needs. I think it would never work from a marketing standpoint. You could never sell this motorcycle, but I'd be so curious about like a BMW R1300 GS, except it was like, an R800 GS or whatever. So it was just like, you still get cruise control and heated grips and electronic suspension and all the fanciness, but you just have an 800cc boxer twin that makes whatever, 100 horsepower or 90 horsepower or something like that. And it makes like good torque, and it's nice, broad, linear, usable power. Like, that would be an interesting bike to me, because I don't need the 140 or whatever. It's like, it's fun.
It gets back to the whole argument that we're having a conversation. Like, people want and buy the bikes because it makes the more power, and it's got the
more
new
HPs,
valve adjusted hydraulic flux capacitor in it, and I can, they're selling the marketing dream. Right. Like, you're going to go out on a road trip. You're going to put your wife on the back. You're going to strap your baby in the Easy Rider, and the family of three, the Quartz family, you're going to leave the cat at home, but you're going to go for a road trip. Maybe you're going to hit a dirt road. You're not going to go crazy off-roading, but you're going to do it. You're going to go adventure riding.
Right.
With the family.
Right.
What's the most horsepower you need?
Yeah. I don't know. Like, what's the most I need, or like what's the most that I would care to have and still enjoy? That's the question we're answering here, right? The second
care
thing.
to have and still enjoy.
I'm going with 80 horsepower.
80 horsepower.
70. You could sell me on 75. And I think I'd have a good time with that.
Yep.
And I think that this category, before we go any further, this category brings up two things in my mind. One, this is one of the hardest ones to define, because to some people, if you're Spurgeon Dunbar, then off-road or adventure riding is off-road oriented. Adventure riding means you are slamming into things, you're splashing through streams, you're getting stuck in the mud, you're like wearing off-road gear, you are going
having a good time off-road and getting muddy.
Mother Nature. Exactly. Whereas to some people, adventure riding is, you're going out with your significant other, or your buddies. You're going to trundle down a dirt road. You're going to take some pictures of some pine trees, perhaps even a cedar if you're lucky, and then you're going to go home, and it's going to be fine. And what you want is a comfortable street bike that is not completely inept and horrible off-road. So that makes the horsepower question so hard to answer in this
I don't think it does, because I think whether you're Spurgeon Dunbar or you're Zachary Quartz,
nice.
It really truly, I think 80 to 90 horsepower is going to do it all.
That's
you
true.
know,
That's true.
like I said, there's times where I sit back and my friend Amelia is who bought my 1090 off of me, so I know the garage that it lives in. And there's times where I sit back and I'm like, I miss that bike. I miss the power. I miss the sound. I miss the way it made me feel. But if I'm being honest with myself, I'm having the best time with less power. And I think that for the average rider out there, they're going to have as much fun with 80 or 90 horsepower as they're going to have with 160 horsepower or 150 horsepower, whatever it ends up being.
Right, whatever it is. Well, one other thing I want to call out in the context of this discussion. Actually, I'm going to hold on that. I'm going to hold on that. We're going to do it at the end of the next discussion because we want to move on. The final category here we're going to cover somewhat randomly is like a street bike. So we're not talking adventure bikes that go off-road. We're not talking a track bike that you're taking to a pure performance environment, and we're not talking about dirt bikes. We're talking about whatever. We're talking about your cruisers, perhaps your UJMs, your sport bikes for the street, your scramblers, your whatever generic street bike.
Naked, yeah.
Before
as we're moving on from this, I just want to give a quick mention, backing up to the final point for adventure bikes for a second, because we're going to see comments about this. There are plenty of riders out there that are going to be saying that 75 to 80 horsepower is way too much. And I just think it speaks to, the problem that you're talking about, where like there's such a wide gauntlet in that range where someone's going to be saying that a DR 650 is the most bike you could ever use. Or I went around the world in a KLR 650. You don't need more than 45 horsepower.
Or a Honda Trail 90 that makes whatever. Like, Ari and I rode Honda. I mean, I rode a Trail 125. He rode a Trail 90 across
because
Alaska,
you needed more
miles.
displacement. You needed more displacement
to make up for my lack of skill. Correct. Yeah. Yeah, I know, but I mean, that's totally true. Like, how much do you need to go on a trip? Almost not like, 3 horsepower, 7, whatever. I mean, you want to be able to get up hills, I guess, but like there's what you need is very, very minimal.
Well, we had Peter Egan on the podcast last time, and one of my favorite stories that we didn't get completely into, but one of my favorite stories that he wrote was when he took a 50cc scooter and he went on a tour to Pikes Peak, Iowa, and his traveling companion was on a road bicycle. And he said that they were about paired for how much their top speed was. One was a little bit faster uphill, one was a little bit faster downhill. And he was like, I was measuring how much money I was spending on gas, and he was measuring how much money he was spending on granola bars. But we had a great time, and we took this amazing road trip, and the bike made about 5 horsepower. Like, it's just, it's all about what you want to do.
Well, it is a good call out that all this stuff is in the context of what Spurgeon and I, sort of enjoy and like. And I think what we're trying to do, quick sidebar of this discussion, is be honest with ourselves in front of you, the high side, low side listener and viewer, in the hopes that you will, take some of it to heart and be honest with yourself about how much you need and what you actually
And
desire.
I swear to God, if one of you makes some freaking comment about I will take less displacement as long as compared to turbo on the motorcycle, I'm going to lose my mind.
Bruce,
so
where you at, Bruce?
Leave it alone, Bruce. Leave it alone.
Okay.
So for yourself, Zach, I'm going to give you, because I feel like I answered the last one first.
Okay.
So street motorcycle, you are the daily rider himself. You're hopping on your motorcycle, you're riding to the office, your dad comes out to visit, you're going to take a 3 or 4 day weekend up into the canyons. You and your wife are going to go out on a date night. You're looking for one motorcycle to do all of it.
Right.
How much horsepower do you need?
Well, good question. I've always said, or I have long said, that 100 is like my sweet spot, And I would say that is my sweet spot. How much do I need? Like, how much can I really sort of live with and have fun with? I think it's the same as the 80. It's the same as the sort of adventure bike answer. 75, 80. That's what I'm. And honestly, that's the same answer as it was for my race bike. Remember, like Ari and I were talking about, if you're going to go racing, what bike would you have? It would be a 75, 80 horsepower bike. So so honestly, that number really is kind of is turning into the center of my horsepower universe, really.
And we didn't discuss this ahead of time.
We did
but
not.
Maybe the ultimate bike just is an SV650 with TKC 80s on it, and you can do anything with it.
That's entirely possible. Next on CTXP, I think that Yeah, I think that I have said that 100 horsepower is my sweet spot, and I do think that I have for the next daily rider in the garage right now. The bike I've been riding for the past couple weeks is a KTM 890 SMT, and that bike's I think 100 well, I think it's actually the same engine as the ADV, so it's 110, 115 maybe, something like that.
Yeah, it's important. Yeah, I guess for what matters for our audience is that the engine that's in the 890 Adventure and then potentially the SMT, Zach will do more research on it for the episode, is different than the engine that is in the Duke. It is
correct.
It is
Different
retarded
cams.
as far as power goes.
Yes. So the point is, that's say it's a 115 horsepower bike, whatever. I'm really enjoying that. It's so fun. And also, I rode home the other day on a Tenere 700, which has 75, right? 70, 75 horsepower, something like that. And that was also fine. My personal bike is around 100. I think it was rated at high 90s when it was new, so it probably realistically makes less than that now. I often find myself riding my personal bike, my KTM 950 Supermoto from 2006, and thinking about 100 horsepower, about, a little over 400 pounds. That's a sweet spot for me. That's a bike you can do just about anything with, and has not diminished in its excitement despite my more than a decade now of testing motorcycles for a living and riding 205 horsepower BMWs and riding 7 horsepower other bikes, whatever. When I get on my bike and it has 90 whatever horsepower, I think, man, this is fun. It's really cool. So 2 answers again. I know I'm giving you 2 answers, which is kind of a cheap shot. But I think it's interesting. I've often said 100 horsepower is the sweet spot, and I do stand by that. But I will admit that if you ask me what I need, or what I quote unquote need to have fun, it would be probably somewhere around that 75, 80 mark, which again has come back in 3 of the 4 categories we've talked about, which I think is interesting.
So I'm going to bring up another question for you.
Wait, but
and this is something that we failed to mention. We failed to talk about this at all in this entire episode. And I can already picture the emails and the comments that are rolling in.
You idiots. How could you
We've
not?
covered this. Ari has covered this recently on the shop manual. We have recently run additional commentary articles about this.
I know what you're going to say. I was going to bring it up at the end after you answered the question. Is that okay? Can we do that? Or you want to do it right now? You can do it right now. Do it right now. I can tell you want to do it right now. I see the look on your face.
No. So here's the deal, people, that you're listening before you start typing away on your keyboards, because you know the question I'm going to ask. We will finish out the street category, and then we will ask the question as to what this other number comes into play and how does it affect all the answers we've already given you. I've often said that my favorite street bike was my Honda VFR. For riding on the highway, for, ripping around the mountains of Tennessee and Virginia.
And for the ladies and gentlemen, that was a 1990 whatever, doesn't matter.
1999.
Honda VFR 800.
Matter.
It does matter. You're right. Especially in the VFR realm, it does matter. But it was a Honda VFR 800, correct? It was an 800cc V4 with a lovely throaty growl. And what approximate horsepower are you looking at? 100? About 100?
I think the claimed horsepower was like 110, but I don't think it made 110. I think it was probably a lot less than that.
Right. Okay. So that was your favorite street bike, and one of the reasons it was your favorite street bike, I gather, in the context of this discussion, is that the amount of power felt right. Is that accurate?
Great. It was, and again, this gets to the question, and I guess we can transition after this, but it wasn't just about the peak horsepower.
Right.
It was about how the power was delivered.
Right.
And I'm not going to give away the question I was going to ask. I'm not going to do it. I'm not going to do it.
Okay.
But I'm going to say the delivery was very linear. The V4 engine was magical.
Right.
And it was all the power wherever you wanted it. You could be at 4,000 RPM. You could be at 8,000 RPM. And you just felt great. It was magical.
And I will say that's one of the things about my personal bike I also love. That it's around 100 horsepower, a little less than 100 horsepower, but it's very broad, linear, strong, just kind of in general. And the last thing I would like to say in this category of street bike, cruiser, naked sport bike, scrambler, whatever your street bike is, how much power is too much on the street. Again, I just want to raise my hand and say it's fun having a lot of horsepower. If you're riding whatever Ducati Diavolo V4, it's just it's too fast. It's too fast. It's got too much power. Come on, let's be realistic here. It has well, I don't even know what the number is, 170, whatever, 175, 180, 165. I don't remember what the number is, but it's an extremely fast motorcycle. And is it too much? Yeah, I think so. But is it fun to like fire up the on-ramp onto the freeway and just have all that horsepower push you from behind? Yeah, also fun. So yeah. I don't mean to exclude people who enjoy horsepower or think that I'm being like elitist and saying like, well, I don't need all that horsepower because I'm above that. I'm not above it. I get it.
Yeah.
I just want to.
There's something about, you know, we kicked off this conversation with the KTM conversation or the KTM comparison,
right?
And like I remember the first time that I threw my leg over that 1290 engine, and it was actually I rode the Super Duke later, but the first 1290 that I rode was the 1290 Adventure S, which was only like 160 something horsepower,
right.
And it was amazing. It was like this thing is just you're just grinning. There's a couple accidental wheelies when you're passing a Honda Civic on the highway, and you're just like, hey, but like it's great. But
yeah.
do I need that to have a good time?
Right.
No.
Right. Fair enough. Okay, Spurgeon.
Yes.
I think we've covered our categories here. I think it's quite interesting. Again, the whole like 75-80 number, just kind of for both of us, but especially myself. I like you said, we didn't plan that out. I didn't see that coming. But now that I'm having this conversation,
I saw you wanting more. Bigger is better. Zach Court story.
So at this point, before we round out the discussion with our kind of like outro questions, ask me the question that you were going to ask her, that you were going to ask before. That brings up the topic of I want to give it away, but it rhymes with Bork.
Our producer Chase is a big dork because he doesn't care about torque. So what is more important for you, Zachary Quartz? Torque or horsepower? Or is it something more about the relationship between the two?
Torque or horsepower? So we should throw to an article that was written by a former physics professor at Stanford that is on our Common Tread website right now called Thor. I believe it's called Thor versus his hammer. Stop comparing horsepower to torque. I'm not going to give away what the upshot of the article is, but it's sort of in the title, right? Thor versus his hammer. You can't have one without the other. They work in tandem, as Spurgeon pointed out. They're not, torque and horsepower aren't two different things that you access at different points. It's all kind of blended together. And I think this whole conversation around how much horsepower is too much horsepower is hard to have without bringing up this topic of like, well, there's also torque and there's also this other number that associates itself with acceleration, with thrust. And it's true. We tried to distill this down, how much horsepower is too much horsepower, as a broad discussion of how much power, how much thrust on tap is too much. And the bikes all differ, right? That BMW M1000R that I rode makes 205 horsepower, but if you open the throttle at 3,000 or 4,000 RPM, it's not hugely fast. It's still a very fast motorcycle, but it's not hugely fast. Whereas if you snap the throttle wide open on a Diavel V4 or even my own old V-twin KTM at 4,000 RPM, it's gonna do something very exciting. And so I think that is a fair thing to call out, Spurgeon. And yeah, did you want to say anything aside from that about the relationship between the two?
If you had to choose more torque and less horsepower or more horsepower and less torque, do you have a preference? Because, and let's just, I want to explain this for the audience. So because this might be getting deep, Ari did a shop manual episode, which I think, and that was actually Jimmy's article was in response to Ari's shop manual episode.
Correct. And we should throw to that as well. Go to YouTube, look up the shop manual horsepower versus torque, and Ari does break down the difference
better than Zach and I are going to do right now.
Oh yeah.
But the horsepower is your ultimate top speed achievement, and the torque is the punch in the gut, just emotion thrust that you get from cranking back on the throttle. So Zach, would you rather have a Yamaha MT-09, which is more of your torque right up front?
I see.
Or would you rather have a Triumph Daytona 675 or 765, which is a little bit calmer leading up to higher horsepower at the end? And that's
what
like
you're presenting to me is two different liquid-cooled 3-cylinder engines, one of which prioritizes torque a little bit more and one of which prioritizes power a little bit more. But they are, from an engine feedback and dynamism standpoint, they are similar in the world of motorcycling. Which one would I choose?
Which would you choose?
Well, because okay, I'll answer the question first. I would go with the more torque tuned, with the torque rich. That's what I would go for. I mean, and I'm the daily rider guy, right? I'm the guy who is always preaching about what's practical and what makes sense.
Yeah.
And
doing wheelies on the street in front of school children. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, that's you.
And nuns
Nutshell.
and that is the thing that is underappreciated, I think, about street bikes that don't have horsepower numbers that are quite as high, is that sometimes they can feel even more dynamic and interesting. And I like to call out Yamaha. Just, I mean, you can call out lots of manufacturers for doing this type of thing, but I think Yamaha has been a real lightning rod for this movement. The MT-07 engine, the twin cylinder engine that's in the MT-07, it's also in the Tenere 700. It's also in the R7 sport bike. That is an engine that doesn't have very impressive horsepower numbers. And I mean, it doesn't, frankly, have particularly impressive torque numbers. But anyone who's used that engine will tell you, man, it's fun. It's really fun. It's playful, and it makes a great amount of power, and the way it's delivered is fun. It sounds good. It's just a great engine. I think it's just great. And so that is something that I would certainly encourage people to think about in their journey through motorcycling, is that sometimes, the numbers don't tell the whole story, for sure.
Yeah. I mean,
what about you, Spurge? Would you go?
I would say
you're
goes back to
a
the dirt
torque
bike.
guy. Come on, you're a torque guy.
That was I mean, I've been called a lot of things in my day. Triumph motorcycles used to actually produce a magazine called Torque. And when I bought my Bonneville, I got a subscription to it for free. It was like 4 issues a year. And I remember Uncle Bob took my copy and defaced it and turned the T into a D. And he's like, you're a dork. You and your dork magazine with your Triumph motorcycle.
Nice move, Bob.
I think the torque conversation gets back to what we were talking about for off-road too. Like we were talking about horsepower in dirt bikes and how it doesn't really matter.
Right.
Because you could put that 350 in first gear and crack the throttle and it'll just, I believe the word you would use is mouse trap you.
Exactly.
Completely backwards. I prefer the balance between the two.
But
same question.
But that's
Same question asked back to me.
Okay,
I would go with the Triumph.
You would?
I think that the Triumph has a better mid-range. It spins up evenly. It doesn't come on too aggressively. And then it kind of just really allows you to play in that mid-range a little bit more.
Yeah.
Where the Yamaha gives you all the torque and then it kind of plateaus straight across. I think the Triumph has more of the balance between the two. And for myself, my father has always taught me from the time I was a little boy on a scooter going downhill, it was all about balance. It was about the right amount of power.
Balance. Sure. Right. Okay. Well, it's interesting. I wouldn't have expected that from you. I would have thought that you would agree with me since I'm right. Anyway, moving on.
It gets back to the VFR 800. It's all about like that bike just spins up perfectly. And I think for me, that's probably what I'm looking for in a motorcycle, especially in my advanced age.
I think you can have both, though. That's why I think in modern motorcycling, leaning toward motorcycles that are either presented as or genuinely do have more torque on tap, or they're presented as being quote unquote torque rich or whatever. Like this engine is supposed to have lots of grunt down low, like low RPM. I think those engines are often a lot more dynamic in the upper part of the revs than people give them credit for. I think the 1290 Super Duke, I haven't ridden the 1390 yet, but the 1290 Super Duke's a perfect example.
We're being kind of biased here. Look at an American V-twin, Harley Davidson Indian.
Sure.
Those are bikes that make a fantastic amount of torque.
True.
I mean, an utterly fantastic amount of torque.
Right.
But they have a red line of like 6,000 RPM. And so we have to be really clear. And this is such a complex topic. And I know that Zach and I are trying to break this down as simply as possible. But a KTM 1390 Super Duke compared to like the biggest engine that Harley Davidson makes are going to be kind of comparable from a displacement standpoint. But one is going to allow you to go to, I don't know, 12 or 13 or 14,000 RPM. I'm guessing. I haven't seen where the red line is on the new Super Duke.
Oh, yeah.
And then one
Maybe
is going to
less
go to
than
like 6,000 RPM.
Right. This is a fair point. And we're leaving a lot on the table here. There's lots of stuff to talk about and dissect, but I think it was supposed to be a discussion about the sort of like I would say cultural opinions from Spurg and myself about how much horsepower is too much for us in certain scenarios. And so we
let's
want to
get away from torque. Let's get away from torque.
Torque is
get
great.
Back to horsepower.
We love torque. Torque is fine.
Absolutely.
Torque is good. Just torque's not invited to this particular party.
Yeah. As Uncle Bob would say, I'm the dorkiest, torquiest guy you might ever meet. But let's get into some of the rounding out questions that we're having here. Where is higher horsepower numbers helping the motorcycle industry, and how where are higher horsepower numbers hurting the motorcycle industry?
It's interesting because we had this written down as where is high horsepower helping and where is it hurting? And I was thinking more like for the rider, and you were thinking more like for the industry. So I think we answer both those questions because it's our podcast and we can do whatever we want, right?
Do it, baby.
Well, I'll answer your question first, though I wasn't prepared for that. Where is it helping and hurting the industry? I mean, I think it helps because it creates a swirl of anticipation and excitement, right? When a bike comes out and has 100 and bejesus horsepower, people get excited about that. And I can't say I agree with it or I'm totally on board, but like that's it provides excitement. It provides spec sheet shopping excitement, doesn't it? Is that a way that it helps, you think?
Yeah. The way that I was gonna word that was, it's allowed for more affordable, reasonable horsepower bikes, right? Like you look at when I was coming out of college in 2006, a Ducati 999 was unattainable. I could not afford one.
Right.
I could barely afford a Triumph Bonneville, and that bike made 124 horsepower.
The Ducati,
the 999.
right?
Flagship. And now their middleweight Panigale V2 makes 155 horsepower. Yeah. So like it is bringing, but then like, so again, go to a 124 horsepower top premium horsepower of the 2006 999. You can go buy a $9,000 Yamaha MT10 or MT09 or a $10,000 Yamaha MT09, and it's going to make 115, 120 horsepower.
Yeah, whatever. Yeah.
Something like that. So like, I think where it's helping the industry is not the 205 horsepower M1000. I think where it's helping the industry is that magic 100 horsepower number that we're talking about no longer is reserved for the unattainable. It is for the masses.
Interesting. Okay. Well, I'll put the second part of the question back to you. Where is it hurting the industry? Why is high horsepower bad?
I don't think we can have this conversation without at least touching on the gentleman's agreement of the late 90s, early 2000s.
Okay. And that does kind of pivot into our next question a little bit, but we can let's just pump the brakes there. Actually, let's cover a couple more topics here.
Okay.
As a rider, Spurgeon, where does having more horsepower, whether it's on a dirt bike or on a racetrack, or
you get in over your head,
that's where it hurts.
You get into a situation where you're not ready for it, and especially as newer riders are coming into the market, and newer riders are seeing, it used to be that 70 horsepower, 80 horsepower was a lot of power,
right? And
we're almost living in this world where we're talking about 70 or 80 horsepower as like, that's almost a beginner bike.
It's almost
and
enough.
That's insane. Like it's like, I think that where it's hurting the average rider is that there's an expectation that you have to have 70 or 80 horsepower, or you have to have 100 horsepower. And that's, I don't think that that's an accurate assessment. What
Yeah,
about yourself?
I think that's fair. Yeah. Yeah, that's definitely. I mean, I was thinking about, like I said, from the rider standpoint. I think that's that is a place that it can hurt. Sort of like culturally, it makes people feel like obligated to reach for more horsepower, or they feel like they need to be able to use it and then they can't, and then perhaps even they're scared away from the pastime because it's too much. So I guess just very quickly, where do you think it's helping? Like where culturally, not as an industry, or yeah, but like a rider yourself, like you. Does higher horsepower ever help you? Does it, like when you went from your 1090 KTM, which made more horsepower than your 890, like you say you miss it sometimes. Was it ever actually helpful? Was it ever actually something that you needed? Or was it just
helpful
adrenaline?
from an emotion standpoint?
Okay, there you go. That's worth something. I think that's worth something.
I mean, and like, it wasn't like I needed that extra 25 horsepower. And I can't do, it's not like, it's not like buying a drill, right? Like I'm doing a lot of house
And
home repair projects right now.
Bought a drill or two, I think. Yeah.
I bought a Milwaukee drill. So shout out to Moto Hitman on Instagram for his recommendations for Milwaukee drills. We met him at Get On Adventure Fest a few years ago, and he's come back to everyone since. But I bumped up a size because I went from like the non-hammer drill feature to the hammer drill feature, which offered more torque for drilling into concrete and masonry, and it really did help me. A motorcycle is not a tool necessarily in that way, the way that we're using them, right? And in some cases, like I talked about with off-road racing, too much horsepower is hurting me because I can't contain it all as I'm in tighter situations.
Right.
So there's not been a situation where I think more horsepower has helped me, but I get back to the fact that some of it's fun. Like my Triumph Bonneville, have I taken the trips on that and had a good time and was able to do it? Yeah. Can you do it too? Anyone out there listening? Absolutely. Go get a Z400, get a Triumph Street Twin, take a cross-country road trip, have a great time. Go to the highest road in the world if you want to. But did I enjoy some of those road trips through the Smoky Mountains on my VFR a little bit more? Yeah, I did.
Okay, that's a great answer. I like that. I think that's
do you have a time where more horsepower hurt you as a rider versus helped you?
Well, like that the situation I was talking about where I rode that CR250 two-stroke motocross bike, and I was riding down that road in the woods, and I opened the throttle and it mousetrapped me, like flicked me off into the gittle weeds.
Less horsepower hurt you.
Well, no, I mean that was more horsepower hurting me because it was too much. Basically, is the point. It was more horsepower than I needed.
I guess it was less horsepower than your street bike is what I was. It was
yes, it was less horsepower. Yeah. I think where higher horsepower helps is totally emotional. Yeah, it's totally emotional. And there are times, right, where you're sort of like, oh, I was on my CRF 250 dirt bike and it makes 20 something horsepower, or CRF 250L, and I was like bogging down through this puddle and I couldn't make it. And then I went back on my buddy's bigger, more rigorous dirt bike that makes more horsepower, and I made it through the mud puddle because I had more horsepower. Sure, do those situations exist? Absolutely. But I think mostly it's an emotional thing, like riding that BMW M1000 single R on a racetrack recently, as we talked about. Like it allowed me to kind of like tap into a section of my adrenal gland that I wouldn't have on a bike with 75 or 80 horsepower. Just feeling the rush of that bike pull on my arms and wheelie at 140 miles an hour was like special. It's cool. I don't like it, it's yeah.
And I think we would be remiss again not to at least talk to the touring motorcyclists out there. There's a lot of people that hop on a motorcycle and head down the freeway, and 40 or 50 horsepower feels wrung out. You're not gonna want to take your cross country trip fully loaded with your significant other on a 40 horsepower bike. It probably, not that you can't do it, you can.
Absolutely.
And you can do it. I'm not saying that, but that is a situation where I can understand the argument from people saying, you know what, there is a reason that a Harley Street Glide is a very comfortable bike to put down 600 miles a day on, or a BMW, GS 1250
or RT
is the right bike to take. Exactly.
Yeah. Right. Because you have roll-on power, you have all this sort of
it's more stable. There's a bit of a the weight helps with stability is what I was trying to get at there. Like it's overall just a better bike in that regard.
Yep.
for that kind of riding.
All right. I think I'm not sure what we're talking about anymore. We got to move on through these last couple things here. So I want you to be able to talk about the gentleman's agreement that you mentioned a minute ago. And we had that under the topic of how and when does displacement creep end? And do you have an answer for this, Spurgeon? Or is there a time when engines don't just get bigger every other year for the sake of whatever, emissions or marketing or whatever?
Government regulation. I think
in other words, they would
going to
just say motorcycle engines can't be any bigger than XYZ for this. Yeah.
Yeah, and I don't know if we're heading there, but that gets back to what the gentleman's agreement was. So there was a situation happening in the late 1990s where Japanese manufacturers
with your Honda Blackbirds,
with your Honda. Well, it started with the Kawasaki ZX
11, maybe
the 11,
12,
yeah,
11, 12.
It was the ZZR 1100, which made 145 horsepower and had a top speed of around 176 miles an hour. So
that was
a fast motorcycle. Honda comes out with the Blackbird, which was a CBR 1100 XX, and that bike had 164 horsepower with a top speed of 179 miles an hour. We're getting crazy now. We're getting crazy, and this is in like 1996, 1997. We're not talking about traction control, ABS, all this other jazz that we have now. We're talking about just raw power. Yeah. Right. There's an Al Gore joke in there somewhere, but I'm not sure. I'm not sure where it's going to land. Suzuki responds with the Hayabusa. And for those of you, Zach, what is the Hayabusa Japanese for?
The Hayabusa is the Japanese peregrine falcon, which eats, Spurgeon, Blackbirds. Right.
Blackbirds.
Very fun little marketing history there.
Suzuki went hardcore at Honda saying, we're going to produce a motorcycle that literally will eat yours alive. And rumor has it that the original Hayabusas had a top speed of 194 miles an hour. Now, the one manufacturer that had no skin in this game is BMW, because at the time, BMW wasn't making high horsepower motorcycles.
Right.
But the rumor has it that BMW pulled all the manufacturers together in Germany and they said, let's pause. Let's make an agreement that from this point on, 186 miles an hour is the magical number.
Which is 300. If it sounds random, that's 300 kilometers an hour.
There you go. Mm-hmm. But they were afraid that if they kept letting manufacturers just make whatever they wanted, that ultimately the government would step in and say, there's too many people out there buying these motorcycles. There's no one regulating them. Their kids are getting hurt. Adults are getting hurt. People are dying on motorcycles. You've made them too fast. So the idea behind the agreement was, let's police ourselves before the government steps in and polices for us.
Right.
And that gentleman's agreement lasted for many years. Who was the one that broke it?
BMW.
With what bike?
S1000RR. Is that right?
S1000RR. Now, the original S1000RR came out, and I remember, if I remember correctly, they didn't break it by much. That bike was capable of much more than 186 miles an hour. But I think the rumor was like they let it go up to like 188. They just teased it, right? They just let it kind of dangle out there on a limb. So up until this point, the manufacturers starting in the early 2000s decided that they're going to police themselves. Do you think that M1000R that you just rode is not capable of going over 200 miles an hour? Come on.
Well, I mean, I don't think it is because it's not aerodynamic enough. But the point is the amount of power that you have. Yeah, exactly. The amount of power that you've put in people's hands is the point here, right? This is the point of this whole podcast, is talking about what is too much and what is enough. And yeah, I mean, that bike's too much. Even if it doesn't go 300 kilometers an hour or 186 miles an hour, it is, I think, by all sort of reasonable accounts, too much. So to circle back, Spurge, what you're saying is you think if there's going to be an end to displacement creep, it will be the someone stepping in, like an entity of some kind, a government or some sort of trade organization or whatever, with a blanket rule or suggestion or something like that to say, like, if a motorcycle engine has 2 cylinders and is liquid cooled, and then it cannot be larger than 1400 cc's or whatever. And if it has, okay, yeah, I don't,
maybe there won't be an end to that. Maybe they will just have a forcible, governor of like the motorcycles can't. We know enough of this. Motorcycles can't go over 125 miles an hour on the street, or something along those lines.
Mm-hmm. And that you think that would just like that might quell the whole horsepower chase to begin with, or in general, and then manufacturers would be like, there's no sense in making a bike bigger so that we can maintain the horsepower even for emissions, because whatever, the bike can only go X fast anyway, so who cares?
Yeah, and I think it redefines, and we've seen this too, man. Like when you think about the biggest advancements in motorcycling in the past 10 years, yes, has horsepower been a big part of that? It has. I mean, like even just looking at the Ducati example, right? Like the Ducati that you and I grew up with as the pinnacle of power and performance is not nearly what the Ducati pinnacle of power and performance is,
right?
15, 20 years later.
True.
But at a certain point, the real advancements that we've seen in motorcycling over the past few years, tires, suspension, electronics, brakes, like everything is so much better now than it was. And I think that's where you're going to continue to see the iterations on motorcycling.
Very fair. Very fair. Well, yeah, I like I said before, I think we left some stuff on the table here, but I think we definitely dug down and got to the point that we wanted to make, I think, which was discussing, revealing, and opining on the topic of horsepower, where it comes from, and how much is too much. Don't you think, Spurg?
Yeah.
Do you think we're good to skip section 6 there? Section 6, just for everybody.
Well, let's make it a quick question. Okay. Like, how is this helping or hurting beginners? Is this, and the example that Zach threw out when we were talking about this was the Ninja 500. Ninja 400, Z400, very capable motorcycle. 45-ish horsepower, really didn't need any more. Do we need a Ninja 500? Do we need to see this displacement creep in beginner bikes?
Right. Yeah, this discussion came up in pre-pro about there used to be a Ninja 250, and then there was a Ninja 300, and then there's a Ninja 400, and now there's a Ninja 500. And is the Ninja 500, by all accounts, a pretty approachable, reasonable motorcycle? Yeah, probably. We haven't ridden it yet, but almost certainly. It's a little bigger than a Ninja 400, which was a completely reasonable motorcycle. It's not way too fast. But the fact is, you have a Ninja 500, which from a marketing standpoint anyway, is twice as much as a Ninja 250. And is there room now for a smaller Ninja? Is there a hole that should be, or that I don't know, that like, yeah, does that hole need to be filled? And I don't know what the answer is.
I think that's where we leave it. And I think for us, for the audience, what do you think? Where is this becoming a problem? And does a beginner motorcyclist out there need a Ninja 500, or they need a Ninja 250? And we're not picking on Kawasaki. It's just that the Ninja 500 press launch is happening, or has just happened by the time you're listening to this.
Right.
So we're going to have, that's a bike that's top of mind for us. And let's leave it there. Let's move on to the engine sound guessing game. But for you, the audience, let us know what you think, either in the comments below if you're watching on YouTube, or shoot us an email over to highsidelowside@revzilla.com.
Indeed. On to the engine sound guessing game. Because we have no guest, and apparently producer Chase has been pulling punches with guests, I have been given to understand, because he said that today, because it's just Spurge and myself that are going to try and guess this engine sound, he has badged it a pro-level engine guessing game. So which is ridiculous, because we are anything but pro level. Because we never get it right anyway, or we rarely get it right, I should say.
Should have pulled this out for Patrick Garvin being on the podcast.
Yeah. Although he did put his foot pretty squarely in his mouth last time we played with him. So nobody's perfect is the point.
Overconfidence can really be a hit to the old groin.
It's true. Okay, so if you haven't played the engine sound guessing game before, this is how it works. We're gonna play the sound of an engine starting up, revving, running, shutting down. We do not know what this engine is. It's been sourced by our lovely producer Chase, and we're going to guess along with you. We're probably going to need some hints today, because evidently it's extra hard today. And
we have an extra hint today. There's 3 hints today.
Oh, right.
For those of you playing at home.
That's true. He did offer a third hint, which is very nice of him. Okay. Well, without further ado, Spurge, should we take a listen to this pro level engine sound?
Crank up your stereos if you're listening at home.
That's right.
It's going to get loud.
Shout it out if you know it. Wow, I could use a little bit higher rev here. I don't know.
That's my question. It's not revving high.
No.
So is it not revving high because, like we
it can't?
talked about with displacement, it can't rev high?
It all comes back to the subject matter. You see, we planned it out like this. You see. Okay, so here's what I'm hearing. At first, I thought, oh man, this is a twin. Like it's got that lopey kind of chugga.
It's a V twin, right?
But then it revved up, and all of a sudden I'm hearing like other stuff happening.
Really?
Yeah. I think so. I don't know. I'm confused. Yeah. At first I thought, oh, big lopey V twin, but no, it's not. It's not. It can't be a twin. I just don't think it can be a twin unless it's a really tiny V twin or something like that. But I don't think that's what it is.
Really? It sounds. I don't know. It sounds like
sounds like a V twin to you? I don't know.
Let's do
I think
this.
it's like a big air cooled V4 inline 4 from yesteryear. But I don't know.
I did not hear that at all. So,
okay. Well, let's.
Interesting.
Should we do a hint?
Before we play it again, because we like to play the sound twice for the audience.
You're right.
Let's do the first hint, and then we'll play it again. So
okay.
The first hint number 1. Oh, we're both wrong. An inline 3 with a 180-degree crankshaft. So this is a triple engine.
Right.
This is an inline 3. So 3 cylinders.
Okay.
With a 180-degree crankshaft.
Let's give another listen. Here we go.
Can I make an educational observation / guess?
Sure.
So, inline 3 motorcycle.
Right.
Not a lot of people made them.
Right. I mean, they're surprisingly common now because you got all the Yamahas that are based on MT-09s and you got all the like Triumphs in the last 10, 15 years. But before that.
But time out, because there's even today, you got Yamaha, you got Triumph, and you got MV Agusta. Is there anyone else making a triple?
Good question.
Not that I can think of.
Like BRP, Polaris, Can-Am. Those are triples.
I don't think that Chase pulled a Can-Am out of his ass for this one.
Well,
personally, maybe that's where we're surprised. No, okay. Here's what I think.
Here's what you think.
If you remember back to the engine sound guessing game 3 episodes ago, we had Spencer Robert on for the trivia episode, which we'll get to in a little bit here because that was a debacle apparently. But we had a Triumph triple Trident, and then we were going back and forth about all the different triples that Triumph made in their original form before they got bought out by the Bloor family. And we were talking about the Hurricane, I think was one. We were talking about the original Trident. I wouldn't put it past producer Chase to have pulled a vintage Triumph triple out of his ass on this one.
Were they 180 cranks? So the first hint was a triple
no
with a 180 crank.
Idea.
I'm gonna go with. Do you remember? Didn't your dad have a Yamaha XS triple from the late 70s, early 80s? My dad did too.
In 1978, there was the Yamaha XS 750 triple,
right?
Which then became the 850 triple for a couple years. That was the only other one that I can remember from the 70s.
Was that a 180 crank? I don't
know. I don't know.
I think those were 120 cranks, which means that it's a triple, so the the crank pins were spaced evenly, like a modern Triumph triple or actually not all modern Triumph triples. God, that's so confusing. Anyway, like a Triumph Street triple or
Don't
a
even
Yamaha
start on
MT-09.
a T-plane crank because
Oh
the
my
T-plane
God. I
crank
don't
was
wanna get
different
into
than.
It is different. I'm 180 crank triple. I'm going with I think it's an Italian brand called a Laverda. Do you remember Laverdas? I think Laverda made a triple with an oddball firing order where two of the pistons went up and down together and the one in the middle went differently or something like that.
A Laverda could be it. I think Laverdas are actually. I wonder if that's one of those Italian brands that is now owned by like a Chinese manufacturer that they're trying to like
Probably.
bring back because there's a couple of those. But
Okay,
Laverda was an older brand.
We
all right,
clearly
let's
need
do
help.
second
Let's go to hint number 2 here.
Zach.
Oh, hint
Zach.
number 2. Model
Hint
produced
number
in
2.
Italy from 1976 to 1982.
So it's not the Triumph. It's not the Yamaha. This
Nope.
could easily be the Laverda.
I think it might be a Laverda. Does that count as a win? I don't even know what the model is. I just remember that they were usually orange, I think.
So let's just jump right to hint number 3.
Okay, hint number 3.
I'll let you pronounce this hint.
Final hint is Schmaverda Schmoda.
So Laverda. He's giving us a rhyming hint. It's a Laverda.
Lota? Mota? Kota?
Lamota? Lakota? Dakota? Listen, people, we're not going to get any closer than this. So if you are listening at home,
I think it might be a Jota or a Jota. Jota.
Jota.
Jota.
All right. The answer is a 1981 Laverta Jota 1000.
Wow.
I'm going to give Zach Quartz the win on this one. He guessed Laverta, and frankly, if I get to win the trivia episode by guessing random Honda that Prince rode for the cover of Purple Rain and not nailing it, then I'm going to give Zach the win for the Laverta Jota 1000 from 1981.
Yep.
Stephen from British Columbia, thank you for sending this in. Jorta is a courtship dance traditional in northern Spain. Steven says that it has a sand cast engine, which is super rare if you know anything about the casting of engines. Those original 1969 Honda CB750s with the sand cast engines worth so much more than the later. Steven also says, noted as the fastest street bike in the world from 1976 to 1978, according to the Jorta specification chart. Yes.
According to Stephen. Well, that was fun. And I think that I would just like to call out for those of you listening to the podcast and not watching it, that the reason, one of the reasons I feel confident in taking credit for this quote unquote victory for getting it quote unquote right, the engine sound guessing game with my guess of a Laverda, is that it's orange. I'm seeing a picture now of Steven's bike and it's orange, which I think is you'd have to know what a Laverda is to call that out. Agreed?
Yeah, but I think you know what a Laverda is just because like I now know looking at the bike, I'm like, oh, I've seen this before. But like Laverda did not even come to mind for a triple. So I did not know that Laverda made triples. I will give you all the credit in the world for this one. For those of you at home, if you've got a rare bike, if you've got a common bike, try to stump Zach and I. We want you to send your year, make, model, any modifications you've made to the bike to iSide, lowside at Revzilla.com. We need a sound clip of the bike starting up, idling, a few good revs, let it idle again. The clip should be about 25 to 30 seconds long, and producer Chase might pick your engine sound to try and stump Zach, myself, and typically a guest. But today, it was just Zach versus Spurge, and Zach took home the gold.
Wow. Thanks, Spurge. Thanks, man. I feel good about it. This is what happens when you grow up with a salty old dad who likes vintage bikes and is always hanging around weird other salty old dudes with weird salty other bikes. Not that you're a salty old dude, Steven. Thank you very much again for sending in your engine sound. That was a lot of fun.
But if I was a betting man, I would bet that you probably are. So let's move on to the T-shirt winner today. Sorry,
Yes,
Steven, you don't get a T-shirt. But for those of you out there that have left us Apple Podcast reviews, we pick Apple Podcasts because currently that is the platform which helps us the most for getting distribution for the podcast out there. It's not because Mr. Jobs has paid us anything to do this.
Too soon.
The winner today, too soon, R.I.P. The winner today, Maroon is pretty. Zach, why do we pick Maroon is pretty? And you have to see how they spelled pretty to understand why I'm saying it. Pretty.
Maroon is pretty. Wrote in and said, I quote, I've developed a bad habit from school of listening and watching everything from YouTube videos and sometimes even movies on 2x speed. Those of you familiar with modern media might know you can listen to like 1.5x, 2x speed, just like get through it faster. I've been there. Maroon is pretty goes on to say, this is the only show I quote suffer through on 1x speed because I want to experience every moment of it. And I gotta say, that is flattering in the world of modern media where there's so much to consume and so much garbage being spewed out of headphones,
our mouths
and
for 2 hours,
all around the world. It is a genuine compliment that you would listen to us on 1x speed and not just speed it up and get through it all. So thank you very much. Maroon is pretty, and we will send you a t-shirt. So send us your preferred t-shirt size and mailing address to highsidelowside@revzilla.com, and we will put a t-shirt in the mail.
The other call out that we have
was the word suffer
around reviews and comments for the trivia episode. This is the first episode that Zach and I are recording since the trivia episode has gone out. It was divisive, I would say. Based on your comments, based on your reviews, people said everything from this is the best thing you've ever done to this was completely unlistenable. Don't ever do this again. And Zach and I are trying to potentially listen to some of the more elegant critiques, thoughtful critiques, to decide if we do this again, what do we want to tweak to make it a little bit different. But I would say in our defense, some of the comments where people were like, you could have answered all these questions in 15 minutes. Why did you drag this on for 2 hours? Because it's a podcast. Mm-hmm. Yes, Spencer could have been like, what motorcycle manufacturer also created tires in Japan in the 1950s? Was it A, Bridgestone, B, who the hell ever, C, D? And Zach and I could have made our guesses, and we could have had that question answered in about 60 seconds. But would it have been as fun not getting
us,
to listen to Lance
sure.
Oliver? Exactly. But maybe for you. So who knows? We have something to learn. If there are any further critiques of the trivia episode, we don't want to hear them. So don't send us an email to highsidelowside@revzilla.com. Certainly do not go on to Apple Podcasts and leave us a review. And for God's sake, whatever you do, don't go onto YouTube and make any more comments on that episode because we've got plenty of feedback.
I think that the real test will be the next episode of trivia that we do, because we had fun with it, so we're probably going to do it again. Spoiler alert. If we do another one and it gets like, it just bombs at the box office, nobody listens to it or watches it, then we'll know that you were all serious about that. And if we do a better job and it actually comes around and people get a kick out of it, then all the better. But the
point
point
is,
is,
real Terminator 2 on our hands, or we could have I don't know. Well, I'm trying to think of a sequel, Land of the Lost 2 or something like that. It was a little dinosaur movie where they make like 7,000 of them. Either way, I'm getting off topic.
Land Before Time.
Land Before Time.
Nice.
Petrie. Hey, mommy.
We definitely need to leave at this point.
Maroon is pretty. Shoot us an email to highsidelowside@revzilla.com. We need your address and your shirt size. We'll send you a shirt. We just need to know what size you want and where to send it to.
Yes, indeed.
High side, low side comment?
On to the high side, low side comment, which we will address. And it has a little something to do with the not the news topic, does it not, Spurgeon? So this came in from Andrew via email. Andrew says, at the end of season 8, episode 3 of High Side, Low Side, that topic was how classic are modern classic motorcycles with Ari Henning. We briefly discussed the role of motorcycling throughout our lives. Spurge mentioned that he isn't as interested in riding on the street anymore. Andrew goes on to say, I'm 31. I've been riding for 15 years. I love motorcycles, but now my life is changing. I'm getting married to someone who doesn't like motorcycles. I have more responsibilities. And I ask the question of risk versus reward related to motorcycles all the time. I feel as if I might have to make a decision as to if I should stop, at least temporarily, or keep going. And so Andrew asks us, as husbands and or fathers who are a little bit older than I am, I was hoping you guys could discuss your honest thoughts about the broad subject of motorcycling as we quote unquote grow up. Spurgeon. What do you think?
Andrew, I don't want to tell you to leave your wife at the altar because I feel like that's a bit much. And I'm sure that she is lovely.
Speaking of divisive.
I also picked this comment for a couple of different reasons. One, I wanted to clarify what I said about not enjoying writing on the street as much. I was specifically, if I'm remembering my quote correctly, talking about commuting in Philadelphia traffic to the office at Revzilla. I don't get to lane split like Zach does. It's a 9-mile commute, and oftentimes it's just easier to hop in the pickup truck, drive down to the office, drive back. I've recently moved to an area a little bit further outside of Philadelphia. I'm still coming into the office, and I am rediscovering how much I enjoy commuting on a motorcycle because it's fun to hop on a bike and save on gas money. It's fun to hop on a bike and feel the emotions a little bit differently on my way to and from work. It kind of helps me prepare for the day and decompress in another way. And I still enjoy my Sunday afternoon rides out on the street. So I think for me, I'm getting back into that. The other thing, and I didn't want to steal Zach's thunder at the beginning of this, and Zach and Ari just did this episode about babies on bikes. My wife went and got herself knocked up, and so we're expecting our
Slept
first
with some
child.
Drunk a-hole some night.
I'm telling you, yeah. So she loves it when I tell people that. She's gonna hate it when she listens to this. But one of the first conversations we had was like, how early are we gonna get a little Strider bike for the kid? Can I get a sidecar for the Bonneville? How are we going to do family outings with motorcycles? So I think my wife, we've had those conversations in the process of talking about having a family and in the process of getting married. And she is somebody that rides a motorcycle too. She has her own, little 230L like we talked about. And so I think for us, motorcycling is very much part of the family discussion. I am just starting this journey. Zach, you're already 18 months into it.
Wow.
How have you and your wife had this discussion, or what have you guys talked about around motorcycling?
Well, yeah, it's a good question. And motorcycling, we met at a motorcycle track day, my wife and I, though she is not a dyed-in-the-wool motorcycle. She didn't grow up riding motorcycles. She has her license, but she's not, she dabbles. She's not a hardcore rider at all. Practically all of the motorcycling she's done, or virtually all of the motorcycling she's done in her life, has been with me, or with a friend who's into it or something like that. She doesn't really have a lot of it in her blood, but she, because of the way we met and because of what my job has been and the person that I am, she has definitely understood that motorcycling is a part of our family now. It's a part of her family. And I appreciate that about her, that she worries, she has concerns, about motorcycling, as anyone might with any hobby that is, either perceived to be or is a little bit dangerous. And she understands that, we're going to offer motorcycling to our son. And if he doesn't like it, then that's okay. That's something that I'm okay with. But if he does like it, I think that's something that she's okay with. And it is a tricky conversation, just like any, this isn't a relationship podcast, but obviously, communication is key with all this kind of stuff, and having an understanding of what you believe in and what your partner believes in is definitely a big piece of it. As for Andrew's question specifically, I think that people, quote unquote, grow up in different ways. People evolve in their motorcycling careers in different ways. And it's really not uncommon for people to ride a motorcycle for when they're quote unquote younger, and then they get married and they have kids and they're like, that just sort of steps into the background, and it's not really something I do for a while. And then when the kids are in high school or the kids go to college or whatever, sort of, I get back into it now. I've met lots of people who've done that and they've been happy with that decision. I think it's totally fine. And if that feels wrong to you, Andrew, then maybe it is wrong, and you should try to maintain some level of motorcycles in your life, despite having a kid and moving forward with a relationship and that kind of thing. So it sounds
like Andrew. Well, I think it sounds almost like, Andrew, maybe you are considering taking a break yourself. It doesn't sound like your fiance is twisting your arm. It sounds like maybe your life is changing in a way that you don't look at motorcycling the same way.
Yeah.
And the example I'll give you, to Zach's point, Spurgeon Sr., when I was 4 years old, my dad sold his Yamaha XS 750, and did
Does
not
not
ride
have a
again.
180 crank, just so everyone
Yeah.
remembers.
But he raised a family of 3 boys, and that was his priority, and he wasn't riding on the weekends or anything like that. And later in life, when I came home with the Bonneville, he went out and bought a V-Strom. A V-Strom of all the motorcycles. and he rediscovered his love for motorcycling after he hung it up and put it away for 20 odd years.
Right.
So you have to figure out what is really right for you. And I think that as long as you're having those communications with your fiance and you're being honest with yourself about what you want to be doing, there is no wrong answer there.
Yeah.
As long as you keep listening to High Side, Low Side, I don't care if you ride or not. Just keep tuning into the podcast.
Right. Yeah, it's a very, very difficult question for us to sort of answer, but I appreciate that you care enough to ask about our thoughts on it, Andrew. And I hope that I hope that your motorcycling career, your motorcycling life can kind of like grow and evolve into the right place that makes you happy, that satisfies your family's concerns they might have, that also brings the right amount of joy to your life, considering all of your new responsibilities and sort of other things you have going on in your life.
So there you have it, Andrew. Hopefully you are now that much wiser based on that rambling mess of words that Zach and I just threw at you. So again, best of luck, Andrew. Shoot us a message. Let us know in a couple months or a couple years what you decide and how it's going for you. We'd love to hear back from you at some point down the road, and let us know how the decision is working out.
And don't forget sorry to just jump in, Spurge. Don't forget to watch that CTXP episode of Babies on Bikes. Maybe that'll help you decide.
There you go. It definitely has helped me with a lot of things in life. So remember to leave us a comment on YouTube. If that's where you're watching, you can always shoot us an email or an engine sound over to highsidelowside@revzilla.com. Please share with your friends. We love it when more people listen to the podcast. We love to hear their opinions about what we're doing right and what we're doing wrong. And with that being said, Zach, your takeaway from this episode. What was right? What was wrong? What were you surprised by?
Right.
What emotions did this evoke in you?
I'd like to circle back, everybody, and just sort of I've compartmentalized a couple of things that Spurgeon talked about in this episode. I'm not saying he was ultra subtle about it, but let's just take a minute and realize and applaud and congratulate you, Spurgeon Dunbar, for impregnating someone, which is all too easy to do. But buying a house is not easy. And you bought a house and your wife is pregnant. You're about to start a family and a new home. And I just want to take a minute and say congratulations as your friend on behalf of all of your High Side, Low Side listeners, all the fans out there who are fans of the Spurgeon Dunbar. Congrats, man. These are big steps you're taking, and you're doing it while you still work hard for your lovely company and your coworkers. So the jokes aside, big steps in your life, and I just want to sort of check those boxes and make sure everyone realizes buying a house and having a kid, and you're moving right along. Congrats, man.
I appreciate that. Yeah, it's been a hell of a year. We did the whole get married, buy the house, and have the kid in a 12-month span, and it's been a lot. It's been a lot of late nights painting and spackling and trying to fix up a house that requires a little bit of work, and then you wake up and you come in and you sit across from Zach Quartz on a computer screen and you produce a podcast or you review some products, or keep common tread running along. So
Sure.
I couldn't do it if it weren't for the team that I had. So I appreciate that. I couldn't do it without my wife at home. Nicole has been easily. She's doing at least 50% of the work of this whole pregnancy thing. So I'll give her half the credit for that.
Okay, Brad.
But
Gold star. You hear that, Nicole?
yeah,
Perfect.
But thank you for that. I appreciate that. We're very excited to follow in the footsteps of one Zach Quartz and Harry Henning, who, thanks to the CTXP episode, I now have some pretty interesting ideas of how about to strap my child down to a motorcycle.
There you go.
Yeah.
Okay, Spurge. What about you? What's your takeaway from today's episode, aside from the fact that you are a grown person, according to the statistics?
A grown up. I am surprised that Zach and I agreed on so many of the horsepower metrics that we discussed today. I was really expecting you to come a little bit more locked and loaded for, I was expecting this to be more of the Zach Quartz episode, and for you to take a bit of that dominance with the horsepower junkie that I know that you can be.
Yeah.
But it seems like you're a bit more even keeled. Maybe it's true. Maybe you, 18 months into fatherhood, maybe that's mellowed you out a little bit.
Maybe it has. There you go, Andrew. This can happen to you too. Maybe you won't be, maybe you won't be feeling the pull of high horsepower or whatever. Yeah, well, that's fair. I think what I tried to do in this episode is be honest and reasonable with myself, like I said, and so that people would hopefully watch this episode and be honest and reasonable with themselves about what is enough. So hopefully you all got a kick out of this, and I think that might be just about it. Yes, Spurg?
Yeah, I'm sure there'll be plenty of unreasonable comments in the in the email and the YouTube section as soon as this episode airs, from people that are being like, 80 horsepower is not enough for you on the street, you wusses. But we disagree. So anyway, thank you for tuning in to the most recent episode of HSLS. I was Zach Quartz myself. From both of us to all of you out there, thanks for joining us today.
See you, everybody.